sent the bill to Ed and it's all. Meeting to order and ask the secretary to call the roll.
Avezana. Arnett. Present. Connolly. Present. Curtis.
Present.
Gilbert.
Present.
Hightower.
Present.
Souter.
Present.
Simmons.
Present.
Williams. Present.
A quorum has been established. Trustee Hightower is unable to attend today in person due to health reasons, and trustee Souter is unable to attend due to work commitments. And pursuant to the board's bylaws, both are permitted to attend if members physically present. Vote to allow them to attend by video or audio conference. Is there a motion to allow trustees Hightower and Souter to join the December 3rd, 2025 meeting virtually?
So moved.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. All in favor signify by saying aye. Opposed, say nay. The motion passes. Trustee Hightower and Souter, it's too bad you're not in Carbondale today because the weather is sunny and 70 degrees here.
Wow, that sounds exciting. One out of two.
All right, the motion passes. There will be a public questions and comments portion available at today's meeting. It lasts up to 15 minutes total, 3 minutes per speaker. Are there any persons who wish to speak today?
No speakers today.
Okay, the next item on the agenda is a presentation by the SIU Simmons Law School and the SIUE Forensic Science Master's Program. Provost Tucker, will you introduce this item?
Absolutely. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be here to present on a program that is a collaboration between SIUE and SIUC. So Provost Cobb and I are always looking for ways that we can collaborate, particularly in the academic program area. But many of you are aware new academic programs take a little more time to work with faculty and get those through the system. And so when we looked at Belleville, particularly since we have special appropriations there, we looked at what was already going on. And so we have SIUE Forensic Sciences and a complete overhaul of the facilities there. And then our SIUC Simmons Law School is also present there with experiential learning, etc. And those on the surface may not sound as related, but they're completely related items. And so we decided we could have a presence in and service to that community by taking those ideas and putting them together. And so today I'm going to have our colleagues here share a successful collaboration called Crime Scene to Courtroom. And our two presenters from Carbondale, we have Casey Parker, who is a JD, 2-degree graduate of SIU, and holds that JD from the Simmons Law School, from the class of 2003. And Casey has started her career at SIU as a non-tenure track faculty member in criminology and criminal justice department. And more recently, she is the law school director of career services. We also have our colleagues from SIUE, Tom Spudich, who is a PhD. His career is an academic career with a current focus on building a master's degree program in forensic science as the program director at Bellevue campus. And he has ties to the forensic and scientific communities all across the world. And as a top educator, he utilizes a flipped classroom in class and laboratory settings, and he is extremely involved in the advancement of science at all levels. In addition, they will introduce students who worked in the program and participants in the program during their presentation. So I think Casey will start.
So thank you for having us. As Provost Tucker said, I am Casey Parker. I am with the Simmons Law School. And both the law school and of course Edwardsville has an annex, if you will, at the Southwest Illinois Center for Justice and Workforce Development. I met Tom when I kind of got to the law school and we started, I got involved in the Belleville programming. And we started talking about things we could do together. We started, and we've done in the last 2 years, we've started a CLE program or continuing legal education program for lawyers in the area. And we focus on criminal justice topics, especially DNA evidence, blood spatter evidence, things of that nature to help train our attorneys who are in criminal law or do criminal law as a practice. And then we decided, this camp kind of came up and we decided that we could do this camp. And we do actually hope for more future collaboration, between the law school and the forensic science program later on as well.
Can we go 2 slides? The next slide, please. So in terms of collaborators for our murder trial, crime scene, the courtroom, we had Professor Sylvia Bayman, who is a new hire. I started in 2024. Professor Bayman started in 2024 as well. She actually runs a lab. We hired her. Previous employment was from St. Louis Metro PD, where she was one of the top DNA analysts, and she is one of the top in the region. We also collaborated with Dawn Waller from the Illinois Math and Science Academy. She helped in terms of organizing the crime scene courtroom, and other collaborators from the law school include interim dean Angela Upchurch, Professor Sheila Simon, and Professor Collingsworth. We also had a collaboration with the Swick Police Academy. We had them involved in the initial stages of the camp, and then we also had Professor Eric Hall from St. Louis University, who helped us in terms of some basic evidence analysis, which I will share later. Next slide. Our student collaborators from the law school, we have recent graduates, Paige and Marissa. From SIUE, we have Carly. Paige and Carly will be commenting later in terms of their experiences. Ethan and Addison are undergraduates in the Edwardsville campus and the different science programs that are listed there. And Emma was as a former student of mine at my previous institution.
So by the numbers, it was one camp. It was a 5-day camp. We had students from 5 different high schools. It was for students going into the 10th through the 12th grade. So they were upperclassmen. We had 36 students total. We ended up putting those 36 folks into 4 different groups. There were 4 different crime scenes that they had an opportunity to go into and look and analyze at what happened in the court or in the crime scenes. Then we had 3 mock trials. So the first 2 days of the camp, actually 2.5 days of the camp, were learning about forensic evidence and gathering that evidence and how to analyze that evidence. And Dr. Speeders will talk more about that in a minute. And the next 2.5 days were, okay, how do I present this in a courtroom? What's relevant information? What's not relevant information? And we had 2 sitting St. Clair judges. We ended up with dividing it down to 3 groups there. And we had 2 sitting St. Clair County judges and then 1 retired St. Clair County judge that was there. We also had attorneys, including my faculty and our interim dean, Angela Upchurch, and myself were there to help the students. We did a lecture for part of the time. I'll talk more about that later. We also were interested, or we also did some breakout sessions, that sort of thing. And the attorneys were there with them, with the students when they did their trial. So they all had somebody there to help them, like, oh, you should object to this, or you should ask this question, that sort of thing. And some of the members were from Simmons Hanley Conroy that came since they were in the area to help us with that particular part. Next slide.
So in terms of the crime scene itself, we went through a process of presenting how to gather evidence, how to store and transport the evidence, and keep track of the chain of custody. So in the previous slide, one of the things that was highlighted was the documentation that was taking place on the evidence bags. You can also see how evidence is being gathered here on the top right. There's a picture of a potential crime scene, and we have students more so getting ready to gather more evidence from the particular scene. And then on the bottom, you can see blood spatter analysis that's taking place by measuring using a ruler. So next slide, please. In terms of the lab work, this was essentially day 2, day 3. And what ended up happening is once the evidence was gathered and taken from the evidence locker and documented accordingly, they did different analyses. They took shoes and made impressions. We did a modified version of a DNA analysis. And we also had them do fingerprint analysis. You can see in this particular photo, we have the students that are actually dusting for fingerprints right now. And then we had an advanced discussion on blood spatter where Professor Eric Hall, who's an expert who used to work for St. Louis Metro Police Department, spend a half day presenting how to do this and give the information with respect to the blood spatter. So next slide, please.
So again, we did a lot of basics of criminal law for them. They learned the roles of everyone who's in the courtroom, etiquette, how to present yourself in front of a judge, rights of the defendants and others that are involved in the courtroom, and elements of a crime. We also did things like they learned how to do an opening and closing statement, direct or cross examinations. And although we didn't get into all of them because there are a lot sometimes, but some basic objections so that they would be able to object during their trial part. Next slide, please.
Great play the video, please.
Hi, my name is Dawson, and one of the reasons I did this forensics camp was because I want to do forensic science in the future, major it in, and second reason was because I'm taking the class right now, and I wanted to get experience with forensics before I took the class. And my favorite part of it was going to the crime scene, analyzing blood spatter, and looking at all the evidence, collecting it. And another part of it was doing the mock trial. And I think having those real professionals there, the medical examiner, the judge, prosecutor, was one of the best things. And I would want to do this again because it was really fun and really exciting. And yeah.
So that was some feedback. We have other feedback.
So the next slide shows some feedback. I won't read this feedback, but my favorite is the bottom one, which I was engaged in all the activities except for blood spatter. And everybody knows that you go to law school because you don't like math. So it was definitely, I'm like, this youngster is on his way to law school. Sorry, Tom, but you
That's okay.
don't see him in your. So I think on Zoom, we have Paige and Harley, who are two of our assistants that we had. And Paige, are you there?
I'm here. Hello, everyone.
Paige, if you want to just give a little bit of information about what you thought of the camp.
Yes, overall, I thought it was a wonderful experience for the campers. I really got to see firsthand just how quickly they became invested in everything. When they didn't know, they just wanted to ask. They wanted to understand what it was like to do the forensic side, and then when it came time to apply what they gathered, what it was like to do the law side. I really just saw a lot of leadership happen. Kids were willing to take on challenges that they hadn't been in scenarios before, and just willing to do the research. They were so excited. I just loved seeing them for the trials. They were all dressed up, and some of them were dressed up in court attire. They had been researching. They wanted to know, how do I anticipate these kind of questions? How do I ask these kinds of questions? And then it was just great to see them just really grow and become confident from the beginning to the end. I had a lot of kids come up to me and ask me what it's like to go to law school, what it was like to study for the bar, what it's like to be an attorney, and just really piqued an interest not only in the professions that were exposed to them, but also just an interest in SIUE and SIUC.
Harley, were you able to share a little bit about your experiences, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name's Harley. I'm a second year forensics master's student at SIUE. I felt it was really beneficial to myself as well as the other students there that we got to do this kind of experience. The camp gave them the opportunity to ask questions like Paige had said, where they wouldn't be able to like in a normal classroom, and how best to pursue the career that they want, as well as they could ask the experts there that are already in the field like their questions, and I was also able to do that. Where I wouldn't have had the experience otherwise. And I also found it beneficial to use the skills that I personally learned in the class and like in the labs that we've done before outside of it and teaching other people. It's just a really good way to know that you understand what's going on.
Thank you, Harley. Next slide, please. One more action. Plans for the future, we plan on having another senior courtroom camp in the summer of 2026. We want to continue to work together as a group. I think we work really well together. And we're going to continue to do so. We are going to focus on areas and improvements. As you do something for the first time, you realize that there are some areas you need to work on. We want to do a better job of distributing the information to all the high schools in the region. We also want to set up the enrollment system to where we can get students from multiple high schools. We had some guidance counselors who really got on it and marketed it to some of their students in some of the bigger high schools, and we had a lot of people enroll. We're going to work on our develop a lottery system moving forward.
We had a wait list, a very long wait list, so this was very exciting to the students, so.
To put things in perspective, we had 48 students register officially, and we ended up having about 36 participate. And that was because they didn't, there was no enrollment fee. So we're going to probably charge a little bit of enrollment fee to help bump that percentages up to about 90–95%. In terms of the wait list was over 100. But we're also limited in terms of space, in terms of what we can do to run something like this, as well as people resources.
And I think it was about 24 hours that we had the 48 spaces filled.
It was very fast. And then from there, in terms of the casework that we'll be doing, we're going to do a better job of correlating in all areas in terms of the evidence collection, the lab work, and the trial itself. And I think that was just more of us learning how to interact and figure out people's strengths in terms of how we can get things done. Registration for the next camp will start in March, and it will be from June 22 through 26. And we want to thank you all for listening and support. Thank you.
Questions? And of course, I have a question. Have you ever thought about moving in the state police crime lab to do a tour of that and see how those technicians do drug analysis and fingerprint analysis and handwriting analysis and things like that?
We can,
Because I've had all of that in my court,
so
where they've testified and stuff.
we can look in incorporating a tour. This past June, Dana retired, and so it was difficult in terms of communicating. They have an interim director. Logistics haven't warranted being able to get in for a tour readily, but we have looked at tours, and our students in our program have.
And what are the age, is this the college age or high school age?
High school, 10th to 12th grade, going into the 10th to the 12th grade.
Okay.
So
Question, what was the application? How was the application set up? How did students apply? Did they have to have prior experience or knowledge? How did you determine who the 48 would be?
So I this past year, it was more along the lines of whoever signed up and expressed an interest were enrolled, and we've actually met recently, and we've come up with a better way to go about it, to where we're going to ask them specifically what their interests are moving forward, and then we're going to use that as an identifier and a placement in terms of a placement for yes, no, maybe, and then based on the number that we get overall.
for me, it was like, I don't know if anybody wants to do this. And then it was like overwhelming. And it was like, oh no, we should have had a little bit more thought process in that. And that's one of the things we learned from it, is that we really need to put a little bit more thought on how to get there. Again, as he said, some of the, we sent it out to like all the local high schools in the Belleville area. Some guidance counselors were on top of it. So we had a whole lot of folks from a lot of those 5 different schools. We probably sent this out to 20 schools, and those 5 just were overwhelmingly the ones that signed up. So we want to kind of limit it to next time is, so we're not going to get 20 people from one school. We're going to try to get more people involved and more students involved in the schools.
Well, I love that it was a collaborative project between SIUC and E. That's really great. And I don't know if you can answer this question, but Are there any programs? I know some universities are starting to have programs where there's a joint BS, maybe a BS JD program. Does Carbondale or Edwardsville have one of those programs, or are there any talks of that? Are you familiar with what I'm saying?
I understand what you're discussing. I'm not aware of what we have in Edwardsville in term outside of science, so I would have to defer to the provost for that.
We have JD degrees, we have JD MD degree. For instance, I think we may or may not, I'm not sure, JD MBA. And there's political science.
Science backwards to JD.
And that's our 3 and 3 program. So we have the 3 and 3 program where you can go as an undergraduate.
That's what I was speaking of.
Yes, so with our new leadership, Dean, Anna Brenner Johnson, we talked a lot more about integrating across both campuses with the undergraduate population to our graduate programs, but also to our law school. And having a more seamless process. Right now, we're over here, right, sort of geographically isolated from main campus. And I don't think there's been that kind of attention that we'd like to see. And that aligns very well with our expectations, and the faculty are excited about it. So, like I said, I'm so glad that we had presenters here today, because these kinds of collaborations, it's just win-win-win. Everything that we're doing really serves not only our institution, but our communities.
So Trustee Williams, there is a joint JD MPA program. That's the first program between Carbondale, Edwardsville. So, and it's the MPA is an online program. That's why it was possible. So a lot of the JD is offered in person, right?
Yes.
And that's one of the things that has to work too.
It's a 3+3 program.
So with the JD MPA, it can be done simultaneously. It's a master's in public administration because the MPA is online. Yeah.
But the courses, the electives can double
Yes,
count
correct.
basically, right? So it creates a streamlined path for a portion of each degree.
Correct.
Any other questions?
At once, so I assume there are some human resource and time limitations, but are there any opportunities to expand or replicate this to reach some of our southernmost? We've actually discussed doing that, since this was, like I said, the first time, and for me, I wasn't sure what would happen. We just, kind of did this in Belleville, but the crime scenes I learned will travel. So we can probably do that here, and that's something that we've discussed is, doing another week here, maybe on this campus, and doing something for the southern region. We had thought about even last year, it just got too complicated, but we thought about busing kids up if they wanted to go, but it was just too much of a complication to do. But there has been some talk about starting the second week.
And if you recall, into the 90s, the state crime lab used to be here, with the integrated into this campus. So we still have faculty expertise in terms of human resources, so that we would have volunteers that can help out forensic side of the program as well if we were in this region.
And the science travels, so that's what we can do a lot on their own. They don't necessarily have to do the DNA analysis. We can give them data based on what we set up for the case that we'll be observing. So it's not difficult to do.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I had a question. This is Sarah. I understand the charging for it to make sure that if somebody registers and takes a spot that they're going to show up. Has there been talk or any discussion about having a scholarship program though, if somebody that wants to do it and wants the opportunity and is going to show up can't afford whatever enrollment fee there is, will there be a possibility for them to submit for a scholarship for the program so it's not prohibitive?
Oh, yes.
Yes, definitely. So we've discussed that as well, and no one will be turned away that shows an interest in it. The only way people will be turned away is if we physically can't handle the number of students that apply. For instance, we had 200 students apply. It was impossible for us to be able to run a camp with the people resources that we had, as well as the facility space.
And we know that sometimes students will ask themselves for a scholarship because they may feel funny about it or whatnot. So we've also discussed maybe having their guidance counselor who may know a little bit more about them and their situation, be able to come to us and say, hey, this kid would really like to do this, but he or she wants a scholarship, if they haven't told you that.
Any other questions?
Tom, what's the proposed fee? $50 is what we're thinking of right now. Thank you.
Hey, well, I want to thank you. I will say that, the first thing you need to tell these students when they get, the very first thing is what they see on TV is not real. You know, crimes are not solved in an hour. I tell jurors that. They're gonna have to wait and hear all the evidence and how it unfolds, but I think this is a marvelous program. The collaboration between Edwardsville and Carbondale is remarkable. And really appreciate the program and like I said, hopefully we can expand it, get some of it down here in the southern part of the state. And like I said, there used to be a crime lab here. I know a couple of the retired crime lab technicians from Carbondale that would love to come in and talk to the students here. Okay. Thank you very much. Okay, the next item is a presentation by President Mahoney. Dr. Mahoney, you may proceed.
Thank you, Chair Gilbert. So this actually is a presentation on college athletics. Give you a little background on how this came about. I did a podcast this summer with our two ADs, as well as the ADs working me at Winthrop. Based on that, I got invited to do another podcast, but I also got invited to present to the Board of Trustees at Kent State about college athletics, where it's been, what's happening now, where it's going. Based on that presentation, the AD at Kent State talked to the AD at Northern Illinois and said, you should invite Dr. Mahoney to come speak to your board. So I spoke to their board a couple of weeks ago. I'm like, at some point I need to speak to my own board and then get everybody else's board. So that's the reason I'm doing this today. This the other thing I will always say, whenever I talk about college athletics, I always feel like I come off as too negative. Keep in mind, I am a college sports fan. I will be spending my weekend at the Illinois Farm Bureau event in Chicago, but if you see me looking down at my phone, I'm watching the Cliff Teen Invitational Wrestling Tournament from Las Vegas. That's how I'll be spending my time. And on top of that, my dad was a college football player, which took him from New York to Pennsylvania, where he met my mom. And so you could legitimately say, I don't exist without college athletics. So I am not down on college athletics. But what I'll talk about first is kind of go back and say how we got here, because I think that's one of the great misunderstandings related to college sports. So if we go to the next slide. So we look at particularly the governance of college sports and how this started. I think there's always this perception that a group of people sat down in a room and said, this is what our goals are, this is our values, and we're going to develop a system that implements that. That is complete mythology. It's about as wrong as Greek mythology. It is no basis in fact whatsoever. College athletics was started by students in direct opposition to the administration and faculty at their universities. In fact, SIU actually had rules come out, policies from the faculty forbidding a football team at Carbondale, forbidding them from representing the university. The students said, well, that's cute. And they did it anyway, and continued to play football. So several years later, they came back and implemented other policies to try to control it, which I'm not sure how well even that worked. I'll give you one of my favorite examples is at Harvard, before they even had intercollegiate athletics, they used to have a game between the freshmen and sophomores. It was kind of an initiation right for the freshmen. It was referred to as Bloody Monday. Bloody because of brutality, and Monday because that was the day that the faculty met and they wanted to do it so the faculty would be in a meeting and wouldn't see that they were playing football. So it was actually, again, in opposition to the faculty. All of the major national organizations, the Intercollegiate Football Association, Intercollegiate Rowing Association, were all developed entirely by faculty with no input, from students, with no input from faculty or administrators. So this thing kind of more evolved than actually was something that they sat down and methodically kind of planned out. The NCAA really starts in 1905. That began by a group of presidents, one of whom watched a player die in front of him. Over 20 players died playing college football in 1905. And so there was a meeting to say, do we just get rid of this whole thing? Again, we're attempting to get rid of college football, or do we actually try to take some control? And that's what they ultimately decided to do. But even with that in mind, the NCAA was a very, very weak volunteer organization for the first 50 years of its existence. No school was penalized until the 1950s. So they had rules about compensating athletes, and you could follow them or not. It was entirely up to you whether you actually did that or not. There was no rules whatsoever that really had to be followed. In the 1950s, they actually formed a more permanent and more powerful NCAA. They actually penalized a couple schools, Kentucky and Bradley were the first two schools penalized. They allowed scholarships, which I will say now we kind of accept as part of the amateur model. If you talk to people who are advocates for amateurs in the early 1900s, they would say that's absurd. That's clearly pay for play. That is not an amateur model. But we just said, well, it's amateur now because we said it is. And the student athletes, that term was coined specifically in the 1950s to focus on this idea of the student over the athlete. So during that period of time, the NCAA was really pretty much a one school, one vote model. So they would have a big national convention, everybody would come together, everyone would vote. I actually saw Charlie Baker, the head of the NCAA, speak recently, and he was talking about the recent governance changes that they've had. And he talks about, well, it's just a little bit of adjustments. I mean, it's the presidents are still at the top in this kind of governance model. He said, it's the way it's always been. I was like, well, if you mean by always, like since I was 30 years old, yeah, it's always been that way. But it actually, for most of its history, was not that way. That's a more recent model. In the 1990s, they moved to a model where the presidents were actually at the top. When it was one school, one vote, it was really the ADs. So it was the athletics people who controlled athletics, and they moved to a model where presidents took over, which had its good and bad sides. In some ways, that made a logical sense, a lot of sense. The institution's really run by the presidents. With the oversight of the board of trustees, it makes sense that they would be the ones in charge. But in many ways, it's been challenging because what happens as you move through to the point where you're a president, you start as a faculty member and you move through positions. You learn pretty much everything about the running of an institution. You learn about the finances, you learn about facility construction, you learn about enrollment management, you learn about all of these things. And then you get to be a president and they throw in college athletics, which you had no training. And I always say it's kind of the equivalent of working your way up to GM, being president, and then saying, oh, by the way, you also run the Detroit Lions. Like you just throw in this whole other thing. So presidents then have to learn something that they know little about. And having talked to presidents over the years, I can tell you many of them, there's a lot they don't know. One of my favorites was I worked with the president when I was at Kent State, who thought that athletics would be self-sustaining at Kent State. I was like, oh, no, that never, ever happened. It's just the financial model will not work. But he came in thinking that that made sense. I will say the other thing that changed in the governance of the NCAA is almost all of the power now is with the Power Four conferences. So while they say presidents are at the top, it is heavily, heavily weighted towards those conferences. So they're pretty much in control. So when we get to future directions, they're pretty much dictating things, frankly, at this point. But one of the things I think that most presidents coming in is thinks that the economic model of college sports makes sense, and it doesn't. And it frankly never has. So they come in with, again, as the president I talked about, this naive idea that this is going to make sense, and it frankly hasn't. We see this all the time. We see this with salaries and contracts. We've seen this in college football a lot just over the last few weeks of how much they're paying, how long these contracts are, and then the number of people who got fired and where we owe, what is it at Kentucky, John?
35 million.
35 million for the Kentucky football coach that they fired. So 35 million for someone not to work for you. All of these things have become the norms of college athletics, and kind of everybody does it. And I will say it's interesting. In some ways, this has been escalating over time, but it's not new. In 1905, Harvard hired their first full-time professional coach and paid him 40% more than the top professor at the university. So this has existed for 100 plus years. This is not new. It's just the gap now is a little bit more than 40% between the football coach in some places and the highest paid professor. But that's just like one aspect. The conference moves is another one where sometimes you think, okay, this is logical. They've figured this out. Someone asked me that when SMU went to the ACC. Clearly they've done the math because they get no allocation from the ACC for a decade. That was part of their deal coming in. And someone said to me, well, obviously they figured this out. I was like, I wouldn't make that assumption. They're guessing somehow this will pay off in the long term, but they don't really know for sure whether it will or it will not. And so again, and even I will say it was funny when friends of mine did a research project several years ago about trying to predict what a coach's salary would be. And you would think success would have been the top predictor. Not at all. It's completely unrelated to the success of the coach. Enrollment was the number one predictor. So in other words, bigger schools can pay more, so they did. That was basically the conclusion. Now, so in a lot of ways, I say none of this makes sense. It makes sense in two ways. Number one is we end up paying a lot because everybody else is paying a lot. So we're building new facilities to keep up with everybody else. In fact, it's interesting with now paying players. One of the things I always heard is, well, we have to pay coaches a lot and we have to have these facilities because that's the way we recruit players because we can't pay them. Now we can pay them and we're still doing the exact same thing with coaches and facilities. Nothing has changed. But everybody else, because everybody else is doing the same thing. So I always refer to Jerry Reinsdorf famously said when arbitration came to baseball, which basically means if you don't understand how arbitration works, it's like if you have a shortstop hitting 250, you go to arbitration and they say, well, that person's worth $10 million. And he famously said, oh, great, now I have to pay as much to my stupidest competitor. And it's a good way of understanding much of what ends up happening in college athletics is we do it because, frankly, everybody else does it. And in fact, we've seen that this season, even this desperation to keep coaches, Nebraska re-upped their coach to a new deal because the rumor was he might go to Penn State. I don't know how many people got new deals because they might go to Penn State, but there's been a lot during this last year. And keep in mind, Penn State only has one head coaching job. So only one of them could possibly be going. And they re-upped him, and I think he's lost like 3 games since then. And so some are even talking about whether they want him for the long term, right after they just redid his deal in the middle of the season. But it is this kind of hyper-competitive, trying to not lose people to other places that kind of leads to that. So it's very much driven by what's happening in other places. The other thing I will say that where it makes some sense is if you look at what the goal is, and the goal within college, like really look at economic modeling, what is the goal? For most organizations, it's profit maximization. That's your goal. So you make decisions based on profit maximization. In college athletics, I've long argued it's winning maximization. The desperation is to win. And we do whatever it is, we spend whatever it takes to win. Here's the problem, and this is a question I always ask my students. We'll see if you can answer it. How many schools are in the top 25? 25. How many are going to be in the top 25 next year? 25. How many in the top 25 are trying to get out of the top 25? 0. How many outside of the top 25 are going to try to get into the top 25? All of them. So you're constantly going after a reward that is limited. And it gets even worse when you talk about how many teams are in the Sweet 16, the Final Four, or win championships. That's an even smaller group. And in some places, the only way you're successful is if you win championships. Otherwise, I mean, I'm an Ohio State graduate. The number of times, thank God for Ryan Day, he finally beat Michigan, but the number of times they wanted to fire him, even after he won a national championship, whether he was the solution for the long term because he lost the game, that's the kind of ridiculousness that happens in college athletics, and it forces us or causes us to spend excessively. All of this has been true for decades, so none of this is new. What we've seen is what it's done to profitability, particularly in recent years. So what we look at when we look at profitability in college athletics is what we call net generated revenue. So net generated revenue looks at the revenue the athletic department actually generates. Because when you look at athletic statements or financial statements for athletics, they can be very deceiving. Because many of them, some of them will have $20, $30 million of institutional support and say we broke even. And you didn't really break even, you shifted $30 million over, you lost $30 million. So net generated revenue looks at what they actually generated, ticket sales, fundraising, the things that they actually got money for. It takes out state support, institutional support, and student fees. That's not considered part of net generated revenue. So when we look at what kind of has happened over time, if you look at net generated revenue, how many schools in the country are actually profitable? And it's generally right around 25. That's what it's been traditionally. Now, again, this is all pre-House, which we'll come back to in a bit. So before House decision, about 25 would be, profitable on an annual basis. But in general, it had been getting worse even before House. Fortunately, there's a guy who actually does FOIA requests at public universities. So now I have a level of detail I've never had before on public universities and their finances. So I can tell you things like a few years ago I couldn't tell you. And he has on his website right now fiscal year 22 through 24. So this is again a couple years old data. And what I found, even looking at the Power Four, so these the Big Ten, SEC, the average losses went from 2 million per school in 22 to 14 million in 24. So they were escalating at a rapid rate, all pre-house, not paying athletes directly, any of those things. We're seeing an escalation in those losses. The mean for every conference was below zero. That doesn't mean no schools were making money, but if you look at the conference mean, it was below zero. The median in the SEC was above zero. That was the only median that was above zero. So even in those Power Four conferences, many of them are losing money, one of which lost over 70 million. So a pretty massive amount. When we go next to the group of five or group of six, we keep changing the numbers on that one, depending on how you count the Pac-12 today. That one's kind of a little bit in flux. But the average loss for a group of five conference school is $28 million. So about double what it is for the Power Four. So the Power Four, because they generate more revenue, again, they have losses that's not as great, but the average is 28. Now that does vary across, but doesn't vary a whole lot. It tends to be in that kind of 15 to much more than that range. What we find is, which is kind of really interesting, is the more you make, the more you lose. So those athletic departments that have the highest level of generated revenue actually have the highest losses, which seems to defy logic. But again, some of this doesn't make a lot of economic sense as I started out with. So, and that's pretty consistent. It's about a 0.35, 0.4 correlation. So the higher the generated revenue goes, the higher the losses go at those athletic departments. We go to the FCS, the average loss is about 16 million. And once again, the more money you make, the more you lose. So even in that one, the NCAA has done some analysis, and those in the top quartile generate about 10 million on average, and they lose 32 million. Those in the bottom quartile only generate 4, but they only lose 10. So the more you generate, the more you tend to lose, which kind of in athletics world, it means if you generate $1, you're probably spending $1.30 or $1.40 more. That's just kind of the way it has traditionally worked. If we look at Division I with no football, the average loss is still 16 million, which in some ways is pretty shocking given that football is usually the biggest financial loser for the group of five schools. So how that, and the FCS schools, so how that ends up still being at that same level is kind of surprising, but that is what it is. And once again, same pattern. The more you make, the more you lose. It's kind of consistent across those other Division I schools. Division II, with football, average loss is 7 million. But I will point out, even at the Division II level, one lost as much as 29 million. So again, even within that, there's a pretty significant range. For without football, it's about 6 million. You go down to Division III, with football, it's about 3.8 million. Without, about 2.3 million. So the losses go down as you go down, not overly surprising. Now, one of the things that you often hear is, well, again, the way this makes financial sense is it has a spillover effect that has an impact in other areas. And I will tell you, this is easy to analyze in one way and really hard in another. So I want to distinguish between the two. The one way it's easy to analyze is you can look at schools and see if you're more successful, does that result in a change? What you can analyze is what is the general impact regardless of the level of success. So I'm going to come back to that one. So, but I'll talk first about if you're more successful, does this result in increased enrollments, increase in fundraising, et cetera? The enrollment one really took off in the 1980s. Some of you are not old enough to remember this, but some of you are. Doug Flutie threw a famous touchdown pass against the University of Miami, and applications to Boston College went up 25%. And this became widely known as the Flutie effect. In enrollment management, everybody talked about it. If we can just get a Flutie effect, that will take care of our enrollment issues. Two problems with the Flutie effect. Number one, their applications went right back to where they were before 2 years later. It's not lasting, it's a temporary blip. Secondly, it didn't change their enrollment. It actually doesn't tend to correlate with enrollment. Success does not change enrollment in general. And we've looked at this, I tried to look at it as much different ways as I could. When I was at Winthrop, where Justin and I were together, I often used to hear the basketball program is what generated our enrollment. And when basketball is successful, we get more students. Wasn't true. It did not have any impact on our enrollment whether we were successful or not successful in basketball. Doesn't mean not that having a basketball program didn't have some benefits. It just means the success wasn't driving it. So again, and then the other one I always use as an example, I had a board member when I was at Winthrop who used to tell me his brother worked for Auburn. And he says, when Cam Newton was the quarterback and won the Heisman, every dean was so happy. They all exceeded their enrollment targets. Everything was great. And he told me this story at least 20 times. So I'm like, I'm just going to look it up. And we want to guess how much Auburn's enrollment went up? It didn't. It was actually, it went down one student. So it was essentially flat. But this mythology that somehow this drove enrollment in a massive way kind of spread around. And this is what often happens. So we hear these stories that sometimes end up not being true. Fundraising, similar story. We've done, actually, this one they've done more research on going back to the 1930s and have never found any relationship between athletic success and fundraising, which in a lot of ways makes sense because people give not because the team won. I always use John Martinson as a good example of he gave because he cares about honors programs. That's what he gave. John Simmons cares about law education. That's what he gave. He wasn't giving because the football team had a good year, the basketball team had a good year. In fact, Carbondale is a good example. We've not had actually the best success in basketball the last few years, and we've had enormous success in fundraising. That's not an unusual story. That actually happens fairly often. The third thing we sometimes hear is, well, what about all that media attention? So they always put a dollar value, like we can't buy this, so much media attention. And that's all true. You get the media attention without a doubt. We follow sports obsessively in this country. That's without a doubt true. But if it doesn't lead to any benefits, then it's really hard to say that it has the same thing. I always say Coca-Cola is not advertising, so you know the name Coca-Cola. They're advertising, so you buy Coca-Cola. And if they're not actually buying your product, be enrollment for us or fundraising or giving money, the media attention is nice, but it doesn't necessarily change the financials for us in a big way. What I can't measure is what the existence of an athletic program it means to a university. And that personally, I believe, is very meaningful. I just can't put a value on it and I can't put a number on it and I can't tell you what it is. So I've even talked with Andrew, like the atmosphere at SIU basketball games is so much better than it was a few years ago. Do I think that there's a benefit to that? Absolutely. It brought the community in. It's a social event that we don't have in universities in any other way, where we bring in community members, university members, all of that. There's a benefit to that. That's hard to put a number on. And it's hard to measure because you can't compare what it is without it. So again, go back to one of my alma maters, Ohio State. Does Ohio State benefit from having a highly successful athletic program? Absolutely. Can I tell you how much? I don't know because they never had it. There's nothing to compare it to. I don't know what it would be like if they weren't what they've always been. And even if you try to compare it to a less successful athletic program, it's hard because they're in a different state. There's different dynamics. It's just never quite the same. So again, this is not to say that athletics doesn't have benefits. It's just hard to put into words. And we don't know what would happen if you don't have athletics, because the one thing no one really has said is we're just going to get rid of our athletic program and we'll see what happens. No one has taken that leap as a university. And so we don't know what would happen if someone did that. And I don't expect anybody will. So that gets us to the next slide. So what's kind of the present issue? The House decision, again, that was a compromise reached based on a lawsuit related to not compensating athletes the way they felt they deserved to be. There's huge financial implications, some of which you may be familiar with, but I'll run through those very, very quickly. What I will say, there was a 2025 survey of presidents. 75% feel worse about where they are with athletics. 86% are more worried about finances than they've ever been before. I will say the ADs are not oblivious to this either. 80% are more worried than they were before. So this is not an attack on the ADs or any of the decisions they're making. We're all kind of feeling this together. What it does is a few things. One is a new payroll up to $20.5 million this year. And it escalates in future years. Now, that's up to 25.5 million. I can look at the chancellors. I'm pretty sure neither one of them have allowed 20.5 million to be spent on athletes at their schools. Most schools outside the Power Four are not going to go to 20.5 million or anything close to that. The Power Four will almost all go, if not all go, to 20.5. Like that's just an expectation for them. So all of that data we just talked about from 24 is going to get much worse. There's no way that they're going to be able to cover that extra money easily. The way they're allocating it generally, at least as much as we can tell, and again, a lot of them aren't being overly open about what they're doing, is about 75% to football, 15% to men's basketball, 5% to women's basketball, and 5% to everybody else. That's about how the allocation, and I'll come back to that issue, but that's about how they're allocating it. There's also a back pay portion. So part of the suit was it was coming from former athletes to say, hey, we should have got compensated. And so now we have to go back and pay those athletes from the past. It's not an indefinite period of time. They have to be athletes who are in a certain period of time. But what the NCAA is doing to help pay for that is reducing our allocation of the money we get from the NCAA. For us, it's about a $500,000 loss per year. So I will say that was one that the Power Four kind of negotiated without really including the other Division I schools and said, this is what we've come to, and you'll take it because we said so. That was kind of how that whole process worked. We didn't really have a lot of say on that. The next thing is the roster size limits. So they actually put limits on roster sizes. This was, you would think, not as much of a problem for some places, but particularly related to Title IX. A lot of schools were having much larger rosters in certain women's sports in order to meet the expectations of Title IX that your proportion of student athletes is similar to your student body's proportion of women. So they were having, say, larger track rosters or swimming rosters or things like that. And in fact, if you often looked at a lot of schools in sports like swimming, track, and others, the roster for the women would be larger than the roster for the men. Now those are all limited. So there's a limit on how big the roster size can be. Part of the reason why some schools did not opt in immediately because they were concerned about the roster size limit. That was a big issue for them. The other thing it did was it changed the scholarship limits as well. So that if your roster size limit, and I'll take my sport of wrestling, is at 30, you can give 30 scholarships now. That used to be 9.9. So you can scholarship in a different way in some of the other sports. That also is going to put enormous pressure on universities. They were not scholarshiping at the same amount. Now, not everybody will give out 30 scholarships in wrestling, but Iowa, Penn State, Oklahoma State, some of those places will start giving out certainly much more than 9.9. 9.9, for those who don't know wrestling, 10 wrestlers wrestle each match. 9.9 meant you couldn't even give a full scholarship to all of your wrestlers. And again, you never know which are the 10 that are going to be in the starting lineup. So when I was doing this, when I was working at West Virginia, I think 2 of our wrestlers were on full scholarship. Almost all the rest had some sort of a partial. That was how they generally did it. Now you don't have to have that. And there's also the College Sports Commission and NIL Go. This is, now with all of this happening, there's 2 things that we're concerned about. One is that people will go above the salary cap. So there's this $20.5 million salary cap. Schools will go above that. And again, given what we've seen in the history of NCAA and compensating athletes in ways that were not consistent with the rules, this is not a new thing. And so part of the goal is to make sure schools are consistent with that salary cap. Again, that only affects a small portion that will be doing that. NIL Go is also to look at all of the NIL agreements that student athletes have and make sure they're legitimate. In other words, it's a fair compensation. So if I'm doing an endorsement at or thing at a car dealership, that what they're giving me to do that is what that really should be valued at. So you can't give me $1 million to do one commercial for a car dealership because that's not anywhere close to the going rate, and those will be rejected. So that's this whole new thing, and actually that also costs money to set up. So we're actually going to have to contribute to that too. So that's another additional cost that we have. So what do we see coming in the future? Probably more lawsuits. And I'll talk about a few of them, but I probably will miss on a whole bunch of them. Remember when I talked about 75, 15, 5? If you're a female athlete, does that sound overly fair to you? Probably not. Is there a chance that someone will sue under Title IX? Almost definitely, as schools don't do that. Now, the argument has been those are the sports that generate the most money, and therefore it's fair for that reason. But again, we don't know where that's going to go, and it certainly won't stop someone from suing. So that's certainly one example. I have that deal with the car dealership. I think it's a fair deal. I'm great at commercials. I mean, $1 million seems reasonable for me to get paid for a commercial. It's rejected by NIL Go. Do I then sue saying I'm being kept from being compensated the way that I think I should be compensated? They're actually trying to right now put in rules so that they can't be sued when they reject these contracts. I think Texas was just recently said, yeah, we don't want to sign on to that. So again, that's still to play out. Remember I talked about why should it? So again, there's multiple places where the lawsuits may not be done. Part of the way that they're trying to deal with this is with what's called the SCORE Act that is in Congress as we speak. And so this is actually one that I didn't do in the previous presentations because it's just been updated today. It's moved forward in the House with one vote, 210 to 209. It lost 3 Republican votes. Obviously, another very partisan issue. It then will go to, if it passes the House, which we expect that it will then go to the Senate. And we've seen this play out many, many times before. The Senate, particularly the Democrats, have their own act called the SAVE Act. Best way to describe SCORE and SAVE, SCORE is basically taking the House Act and saying that now becomes the law of the land. So what that agreement was, that compromise that they reached to settlement in the House decision, that becomes kind of permanent and in legislation. So it really gives some antitrust exemptions to the NCAA to be able to do that, so that they won't keep getting sued in all the ways I just talked about. And the NCAA really, really likes that. I will say I get letters, I get emails, don't get emails probably daily. I'll talk to your legislators about supporting the SCORE Act. I mean, this is one that they really want. And the Republicans are generally supportive, although not unanimously. The Democrats, on the other hand, see this as against the student athlete and anti-labor in some ways. And the SAVE Act is much more pro-student athlete, which is the Democrat version in the Senate. And so there's a very good chance this goes nowhere in the Senate because the filibuster rule and everything else we will following on all kinds of other things. That being said, doesn't mean that this will even solve everything. So even if somehow the SCORE Act does get through, and I'm wrong, I guess that President Trump had it signed, we still have all of the problems I just talked about. It just cements them as predictable as opposed to unpredictable going forward, but it doesn't solve a lot of the problems. And that's been my criticism, frankly, of it all along. I think we're at a moment where we need to be rethinking everything and be much more open to a more radical changes, and that's not what's being discussed by any of the groups. The Power of Four, I am still waiting to see all of the things they may end up doing. Up until now, because they're in this power position, they've stayed with everybody else. There is a possibility they just break off on their own, particularly even if it's just in football, and do their own thing. That is not outside the realm of possibility. And we don't know whether that will happen or not happen. But the reality is right now they are desperate for money in a way that many of them were not before. So they will do whatever they think is in their financial best interest. In fact, I had at least one FCS AD tell me that they were actually surprised it hasn't happened already. They would have thought they would have done this. Moving up or moving down, will schools move up or down in different divisions? What I can say is we continue to see schools move up. That's not an uncommon thing. There's schools that are pursuing that as we speak. Moving down, I can't analyze because it's only happened like 4 or 5 times in the history of college sports. It almost never happens. Even though, again, if you looked at the math I just talked about, moving down to Division II or Division III would be a massive savings. No one really hardly is talking about it. There have been a few examples. Hartford recently, St. Francis made the NCAA basketball tournament last year and then decided to move down, which was kind of a big shock to people. Savannah State, I think I'm missing one or two others, but it's very rare. What does that do to all of those factors, fundraising, enrollment? We have no idea because there's not enough of them to look at. And they're also vastly different than most of the institutions. They're unique in their own ways. So it's hard to say whether other schools will do that. But for right now, it still seems moving up is more common than moving down. What I do think we'll start to see, while you can again offer those maximum scholarships, we're seeing more schools talk about being non-scholarship sports, even at places like Ohio State and UCLA and others who are saying, you know, when it comes to track and field or swimming or whatever, we're just not offering scholarship. We shouldn't be offering scholarship. We can't afford to do that. I think that will come more. So we'll see a bit of a kind of Division III model at the Division I level in certain sports. I do think that is probably likely, or even reducing the number of scholarships in those sports. I will say that's hard to do because it's kind of the equivalent of unilateral disarmament. Because when you do that, it costs you money, or costs you wins. And if winning is your priority, you're just not going to be successful. I will say when I was at Winthrop, I did a lot of in-depth analysis on our sports programs, and our track and field program made us by about $500,000 a year because we offered very few scholarships. We had a lot of athletes paying tuition to the university. It was not a high cost program. There wasn't a lot of travel, wasn't a lot of those things. Now, ask me if we were a successful program, I will tell you, no, absolutely, we were not a successful program, despite having very good coaches who I liked a lot, but there's just no way they could compete with the schools that were basically putting far more resources in the track and field than we were. So there's ways of doing that. So it's hard to hold to that too, because you're not generally going to be as successful. And I will say, even when you are successful, sometimes it's people then double down, which we've seen happen a lot. There's a big talk about private equity. This has particularly been big news in the Big Ten, where they had this big discussion of going outside to bring in private equity to help support all of these things. Board of Trustees got very involved and were quite upset that they were not as involved as they felt they should have been. Many of the schools, Michigan and others, USC, were like, we don't want any part of this. So this hasn't gone anywhere. So it's been talked about a lot in the college athletics world, but no one has moved forward with it yet. And whether that's really just an option for the Power Four or an option for other schools, it's hard to say at this point. Given the amount of losses that we generally have, it doesn't seem like it's one that makes a lot of sense. But again, if you take out some aspect, and we've done this with marketing in other areas where we outsource some of that, there are ways that you could see this happening. Do I think it would solve everything? I don't think so. I think the other thing that will be interesting to see is the way the model now works. There is an opportunity if you want to build up a program in a certain area and be national champions, or at least national championship contenders, you can do that even at a school that traditionally isn't known for being a top sports program. Even before this, I think one of the best examples has been Coastal Carolina in baseball, that has once won a national championship and played for it in the last decade. Coastal Carolina does not have an outstanding football team. It doesn't have an outstanding basketball team, but boy, they have an outstanding baseball team, and they really put their resources into that. Now it's even easier. And I'll take my sport of wrestling. You can do 30 scholarships, and you can use all $20.5 million on just wrestling. And someone will take my idea to do it, but no, you can do all of that. And you can have a program that will be a national contender overnight. That is very easy to do. Whether someone will do that or not, we'll see. Probably not to that extent, but they may go in a lot more on a sport that they actually have a chance to be much more successful. Or one of the examples, and this is again, not necessarily a new thing. My father, I told you, played college sports. He was a football player at Clarion University in Pennsylvania. Was almost on their first wrestling team that they started in 1959, 1960. Clarion decided that, hey, we're not going to compete nationally in football and basketball and these other sports. So we're going to pick one men's sport and one women's sport. They were progressive ahead of their time. They picked men's wrestling and women's gymnastics, and they went all in on that. By the 1970s, early 1970s, just a little over a decade after my dad left, of the 10 national champions in Division I wrestling that year, 3 were from Clarion. They were one of the most dominant programs of the 1970s by investing heavily in a sport that others weren't. Now, they took advantage of Pennsylvania's the best high school wrestling state in the country. They picked those sports for a reason, but there's an opportunity to do that in a way there hasn't been before. But I think that what I would say is it's a probably much more likely model to be successful than some of the other things we've seen. One of the things that was interesting when I went through it 10 years ago in the Big South, they had just done a strategic plan. So I kind of walked in, they gave me this. And it was, we're going to double down on men's basketball and women's basketball. Like we're going to go all in. This was when you could do the full cost of attendance. We're going to do that for our men's and women's basketball team. We're all as a conference committed to doing what we can to, because that's where we'll get the most attention, which in some ways, makes sense. And I will tell you, how did that experiment work? Well, we're 10 years into it. They've won 3 NCAA tournament games in those 10 years. They were all 16 play-in games, which means if you're a 16 seed, you're one of the 4 worst teams in the tournament. Of the round of 64 games, they have lost every single one and never by less than double digits. So they doubled down on basketball, and it has not changed at all the success level of men's and women's basketball. It's really hard because, back to what I said, everybody's investing heavily in basketball, so it's hard to be competitive or change your competitive stature in a sports like basketball. So what do we see going forward, or how do we? I think part of what I've said to a lot of people is, thinking about what are your goals? What is it that you're trying to do, and being realistic about what that is? The Big South plan probably wasn't all that realistic, but there are other things that we can do. And how do you maybe take athletics to do some of the things that it doesn't automatically do? I would say one of the problems is we assume if we do this, this will automatically happen, as opposed to being much more thoughtful. One of the things that when I was talking with one of the other boards I talked about was, like, for example, when we go and play away games, do we do something on top of the game, which we have done in many cases. When we were playing Purdue, just as an example, we went to Indianapolis. We visited schools in Indianapolis, tried to recruit students from Indianapolis, connected with alumni, all of which helps back. So we actually were thoughtful, and then we went down to West Lafayette. So we do things where we're actually tying athletics to those goals in a much more thoughtful way than simply assuming of, hey, we go play Purdue, we'll be on TV and we'll get more students and we'll get more fundraising money. That never has worked. Being more thoughtful about it probably is. I think deciding how you want to invest your money, how do you want to do that, but understanding that this is a cost item that is difficult to get away from unless you're really willing to be rather thoughtful about, okay, we're going to be like the program I talked about, we're not going to be overly successful in that. But even I will say some places have added sports to raise revenue, but then you've got to be consistent on your plan. And so I'll give you 2 examples from my time at Winthrop. They added women's lacrosse right before I got there. And part of the way they sold it to the board was we're going to make this profitable because we're going to only give a couple scholarships. We won't invest in women's lacrosse, but we'll have this new program and help us with Title IX, all of these things. And I think that lasted maybe a year or 2.
By the time I got there were scholarships.
What's that?
By the time I got there were scholarships.
Yeah, there were more scholarships. It wasn't just like, originally it was kind of like, oh, we'll have 2. Then it was, whatever the max was, we were pushing towards the max. So it became harder and harder to control what was a very logical plan going into it. The other one, which we did when I was there, was we started an esports program. And that was one where we were kind of ahead of the curve on that. And we figured, okay, we can bring in like 23 students. We can give them some scholarship, but they're students who would never have come to us otherwise. They'll pay, if we give them a scholarship of $5,000, they're still paying us $10,000 of tuition. It's a low-cost program. We hired a young guy. I think we paid him like $30,000 or something like that at the time as a salary. This was a low-cost, low-investment program that we could start, and it was clearly going to be profitable for us. And we've actually, within, I think it was 2 years, won a national championship in esports. So we got some attention in the sport that, again, no one else was doing. I think since I have left, they have invested. God, we're successful. We got to keep being successful. So we got to pay the coach more. We got to do this. So everything that we built as a model is hard to keep to, even when so it's hard to keep to when you're not successful. Because everybody's like, why aren't you successful? And it's hard to keep you when you are successful because people are like, you got to continue to be successful, which gets us back to the challenges. So that's kind of where we are in college athletics today, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
But Dan, you
Yeah.
said there was a limit now, $20.5
Yeah.
million to pay athletes. So you're following all this SEC, massive changes.
Yeah, yeah.
It was at least reported that LSU guaranteed 25 million just for football, just to pay
Mhm.
for next year. And the other schools are gonna have to match that,
Right.
Texas or Florida or
Right,
something.
yeah.
How does that foot with?
The only thing I could figure out, I just saw that too, and I'm trying to figure out what exactly they're doing. It's LSU, I don't know what they, what they think they're doing, but I think one of the things that they're probably doing is also getting money still from donors through collectives, where part of that compensation won't be, because part of the 20.5 million is you're just paid for playing, like there's no expectation of other responsibilities. With NIL, you can get additional money through doing certain things. And a lot of schools still have the collectives, and the collectives were a creation to kind of help generate NIL money and funnel it to the athletes in a more kind of controlled way than just letting them all go out and find these deals on their own. So I think part of what is in that 25 million is their commitment to bring in money in other ways. And so the athlete might have to do an appearance here or do this type of thing in order to earn that additional money, as opposed to just being paid right out. That's the only thing I can figure that would fall within the rules. But once you start doing that, and this has been part of the issue with contracts with coaches, is we look at what they get paid, which is a lot, but there's also stipulations in there over time, for example, that they have to be one of the 10 highest paid coaches. You quickly find out how that becomes a real problem, because not everybody can be in the top 10 highest paid coaches. So it keeps escalating salaries. Some of that in there that their assistant coaches have to be the 10 highest paid assistant coaches, staff. And now we're getting into, I'm guaranteed this amount of NIL money to build my roster. So it adds more things than even just the salary, which was in his case quite large.
And I think donors, you got to, it's one thing to raise money one year, but it's got to be every year. It's got to escalate, and eventually you're going to get donor fatigue. That it's like.
But you're also losing that for facilities. They were normally getting that for facilities, now it's going straight to the students, so they're also going to lose.
The other issue is will this actually funnel money away from people wanted to support athletics, now are being asked to support the athletes through their contributions, and does that take money away from the other things that we need the money for in athletics? And there actually is some research on the University of Oregon, and this is 20 years ago, but that as they got better in athletics, more people were funneling their money to athletics and away from the rest of the institution. So university fundraising actually went down with athletic success because they were funneling it to athletics. Now maybe we're getting less money in other areas of athletics, so we can compensate the athletes more. So, I mean, there is a limited donor pool, as you say, and there is donor fatigue. And so that's, I think, all concerns for places.
But I think the Power Four programs, and I'll be quiet, in basketball.
Yeah.
So basketball it's almost so much money for these student athletes. If you're playing in the Big Ten, every year you got a whole new roster because somebody can outbid you for that student. And so as a fan, it's not so much fun to watch your school if you can't get to know players and watch them for a few years.
And that's part of what they want to try to do in the SCORE Act, is actually limit the transfer, the ability of athletes to transfer every year, which is kind of what we have at this point. So that's part of what they're trying to do too, to control, which again is part of the reason those who are advocating for the athletes say, well, we want them to be able to do whatever they want to do. But yeah, it's been an open bidding thing. One of the other things, basketball is kind of really interesting because there's an argument that it's not a Power Four, because the Big East is an elite basketball conference, but doesn't generally offer football. So it's actually a Power Five. They have the same $20.5 million salary cap and no football team. That changes the competitive balance in a pretty significant way.
You saw it last year in the tournament. How many upsets did you see in the March Madness?
Yeah.
0.
Yeah.
I mean, that's all because money is going to these teams and they're paying players.
Yeah. So anyways, but yeah, so that's, so a lot of it, again, there's some weird dynamics with all of it, as you look at the different schools and the programs they offer.
Dr. Hightower.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Chairman. Dan, very good report, but I want to just bring up a couple of issues. And again, for maybe some of the trustees that don't know my background, I spent 33 years as an official in the Big Ten. And at that time, I was heavily involved with the NCAA as far as trying to promote change and that help student athletes. Then I spent over 2 years, almost 3 years, as senior advisor to Commissioner Warren as the Big Ten was transitioning the additional teams from out west. So I do have a little background, and I do agree with Dan. There's not concrete information that shows that that athletics will have a long-term impact on enrollment and fundraising. But I will, and I don't think there is a concrete hypothesis developed and proven that it does or it does not. Is that true, Dan? Help me here.
Yeah, so like I say, there's a difference between looking at whether winning has an impact or whether its very existence has an impact. I would argue its very existence certainly does. It's hard to judge because we don't have the comparison of what if it didn't exist. So it's hard to do some research wise.
Exactly. So, but what you have to keep in mind is that a successful athletic program will have a bump. It will provide an opportunity for that university to gain traction. One, two, establish a strong brand for itself. Thirdly, give it thoughtful and intentional planning going forward. That is where where the athletic culture has to go if we're going to stay attuned to the many changing dynamics that are occurring in athletics. Now, I want to just bring in, again, this is not my presentation. I'm agreeing with what President Mahoney is saying, but I'm also saying that look at SIUE. You know, I'm a graduate of SIU. I was recruited there in 1970. When I was recruited there in 1970, we did not have a gym. We played in a bubble in basketball. We played at the SIU Dental Gymnasium. We played our games at Edwardsville High School. Fast forward, we have made the decision to go to Division I. Over the last 3 years, and I don't have the exact numbers, but I do know that during the last 2 years at SIU, we have had a big bump in participation. Which gives us an opportunity to get more fundraising, more donorship, and establish a brand. Now, whether we can maintain that brand that we establish, that is the key to success. You know, one of my closest friends, and you mentioned him a couple of times, Dan, is Gene Smith, the athletic director at Ohio State, was athletic director. Gene and I, we spent a lot of time together. And Gene was thoughtful and intentional as we began to go toward the NIL, the transfer portal. The universities, once you, and that notoriety, whether it's SIUE, where it's SIU Carbondale with the athletic programs that we have at both. It is critical that we use that opportunity that we have for success to not only create, but expand our brand and look at alternative ways of finding funding. Now, that's through donorship, and that's what, as you look at Ohio State, and this is not something I heard, this is something I know as a fact. The donorship is what is keeping Ohio State afloat. Gene was ahead of the game and began to talk to his donors. If we're going to stay ahead of the curve, we have to raise more money because the overhead is going to be so much greater. When the Big Ten began to bring in all of those, the schools from out west, I know this for a fact because I was part of those discussions. Everybody looked at, okay, how much money is this going to generate with this big TV contract, which was humongous. But then, no, I'm sure they did, the travel, the overhead, the expense. So the universities aren't making all of this money. And the biggest criticism of Dan, and I strong leadership for some time in this industry. When we began paying athletes, NCAA, we encouraged them to get ahead of this game. And it goes back to the Fab Five. You look at how much money they brought into the institutions, but they were not able to be paid. Those kids could not even go. Their merchandise were being sold at an enormous price tag, but those kids were not getting any of it. The NCAA stood on its hind legs and never got involved in that process of supporting change. We go fast forward to gambling. Now, all of a sudden, if you think that we're going to just have gambling and everybody's going to do the right thing, no, I don't think that's. Now, all of a sudden, guess what we want to do? We want to throw all of the athletes out of school and so on. Okay, the same thing as we look at the private equity with the few schools that are even talking about it. If you allow this private equity to get into the doors of collegiate sports, there are unintended consequences that are going to happen. So if I thought your presentation was absolutely spot on. But I would encourage our board, our athletic department, and I've not done a dissertation, but I do understand what hypothesis mean. I do understand what proven a statement, how you go about it, as we all have done research and understand that. If with our athletic programs, Carbondale, our basketball program years ago, we went through a 5-year period with our athletic program where we were the darlings of the Midwest. Our brand went up, enrollment went up, donorship increased. We're seeing the same thing at SIUE now. But my recommendation to our athletic department and to our administration, along with our trustees, we have to be intentional, thoughtful, and really pushing out our brand. So when this bump leave us, we can then continue the success that we hope that our athletic facilities, our athletic departments, and the individual athletic sports have given us. So I just want to say that as an individual that has certainly from an administrative point of view, if I could add one last thing, this is in period data. When I went to Edwardsville as superintendent of schools, In 1996, we had poor facilities. We had enrollment of 5,000 kids. We intentionally established a brand, and we were thoughtful in our planning. As a result, we saw major increases in our donorship that supported academics, performing arts, facilities, and our athletics. And when you look at Edwardsville today, no other downstate school district has the enrollment that we have the facilities, are basically the success. And then more data, you look at the growth that has happened in this community. So there is that parallel, but you've got to be, and you used the word intentional earlier, those three things, brand, thoughtful, and intentional, are the three areas that we must focus on, as well as the NCAA, if it's going to make substantial changes going forward to address this changing industry that will continue to have unintended consequences if we don't give it a very thoughtful and meaningful way of thinking looking forward. Those are my comments on that. Great report.
Thank you, Dr. Hightower, and I think those comments are well taken. I do believe that we need to be thinking about all this, and we need to be try to get ahead of the curve as much as we can. So, yeah, John?
I just had a question and a comment. One question, you said no school has taken it upon themselves to eliminate athletics yet. How and when do you think that would happen?
I don't know if it will, because it's a pretty big leap, I think, for most schools to do. I've seen that there's been some universities that have merged together in different locations, and so the athletics kind of went away. Like, there's still athletics, but it's at kind of the one campus and not both places. That's as close as you get. But those were always ones where there was already kind of an enrollment decline, and so enrollment continued to decline, but how much of that was because athletics wasn't there? So again, we don't have a lot of information. I don't see anybody going away from it. I will say part of and I think Ed hit on this well, part of the issue I think that is challenging in all of this, the NCAA tends to try to protect the things the way they are. They have never been an organization that's looking forward in a massive way. And even as we have now the House settlement, they kind of, we'll adapt that, but we'll keep everything else as close to normal as possible. Whereas again, I advocate this is probably the moment where you should say, what should it look like? So even I mentioned before, at Division I level, you're required to offer a certain number of sports. Does that really make any sense? Maybe you'd rather offer 8 sports really well than offer 16 sports and do them all poorly funded. Like, I mean, again, you should have that. I'm not saying that's what we should, but I'm saying you should have that kind of flexibility going forward. That doesn't suggest getting rid of athletics completely, but maybe doing it in a different way than we're currently even frankly allowed to do. That doesn't tend to be the NCAA's way of doing things. It's kind of more of we'll keep things the way that they are. And again, even I talked about the irrational economics. One of the things I think was interesting is as we started to talk about this, even if someone mentioned anything remotely like I was, well, we got to protect the Olympic sports because we have to have a good Olympic team. I'll take a sport I love too, women's volleyball. We have 1,800 women's volleyball teams in the country for 12 spots on an Olympic team every 4 years. That is not a really efficient model to build an Olympic team on. But we make this argument that we have to keep, and again, I'm not advocating for getting rid of women's volleyball. It's one of my favorite sports to watch. But that's, again, some of the arguments. So we end up, and that's been a lot of the discussion, because that will destroy our entire Olympic movement, and that's just not a really rational way of thinking about it. So anyway, so I think I wish the NCAA at this point, I think to Ed's point, was providing more leadership. I wish they had through the last decade, where I think they failed at moments to actually step forward and say, we can see some of these changes coming. Let's talk about it. They really fought against almost every one of these changes and ultimately lost legally. Actually, one of the cases that went to the Supreme Court, I use this one in class as an example, they lost 9-0. In the current makeup of the Supreme Court, the number of times you lose 9-0 is almost non-existent. I mean, that's when you've got a really bad case, when you're losing 9-0 at the Supreme Court level. But that's kind of what has happened with the NCAA.
And the comment is, before we ever get too far with venture capital money.
Yeah.
Please come to us early.
Yeah.
Because me and Dr. Hightower may want to wrestle about it.
No, that was a good example. I think that was the problem with the Big Ten is they were moving really fast and the boards were like, well, wait a second, you're moving ahead of us.
Yeah, those.
And they were not happy. Yeah, they were not happy. But I think one of the other points Ed made too, which I think is a good one, is that, part of what I say at the end of these, all of the boards, including this one, is you have to decide what is it we want and how do we get to where we want. And that's, given now that you're hopefully as informed as I possibly can do in 30 minutes of where college athletics been, where we are today, what is it that you see as the best steps going forward, becomes a little bit easier. And so that's kind of what the goal generally of the presentation is. But it's not to get rid of sports completely. That I don't think is happening here or anywhere else.
Right.
Any other questions?
Let me make one other statement that Dan touched on that I think is critical. And I'm still very close to several of the Division I national coaches, very close. And I won't throw out any name. I won't do name dropping here. But I've had in recent weeks, couple months, I've had three of the named national coaches say, Ed, what do you think? What is the answer to this NIL? And my statement has been, and I'll make this as a public statement. The answer is it's not going away. It isn't going away. The NCAA did not get ahead of the game. The horse is out of the barn, so we're not going to get it back in. But what we have to do now is control the time. If I sign a contract, just treat this as a professional contract. If I give you money, you at least have to stay at that university for 2 years. Right now, it's a wild, wild west. I was talking to one head coach just in the last couple of weeks, and the individual said to me, I'm having to change the way that I deal with my players on the bench when they make a mistake. Because if I get after that player too hard out there in public on national TV, somebody is recruiting that player that same night, right after the game. So the NCAA has to step up, and I think, Dan, you touched on this a little bit, and say, okay, this contract means something. You have to at least stay at that university for this period of time, or you lose that money. Dan, could you just touch on that if you don't mind?
Yeah, no, I think that's, and there have been solutions like that, I think, suggested. And I don't disagree, that would make things a lot easier from a planning perspective. That also means the university has to make a 2-year commitment to that player. And
yes.
Until recently, most people didn't realize scholarships were not 4-year scholarships. They were annually renewable. So all the power was really with the coaches and the university, and now it's kind of shifted in the other direction. There seems like there's a way to get somewhere in the middle of that. And I think kind of what you're suggesting is a good idea. And I will say too, on the NIL piece of it, that was one I probably 20 plus years ago in class, I was saying the NCAA should give on NIL. That's just not legally defensible. The people who can't make money off their name, image, and likeness are college athletes and convicted felons. And if that's the only groups that aren't able to use their own name, image, and likeness, something's wrong with the system. And I was like, I never thought it was legally defensible. It was just a matter of having the right case, which first was the O'Bannon case, and then kind of went from there. But that was always a bad position. To your point, they could have got ahead of this a long time ago. And I think even if they'd given on name, image, and likeness 20 years ago, we may have avoided all of the house and everything
Absolutely.
else. Yeah, they would have avoided all of this, but we're past that point. But I do think, again, people are looking at that. I will say one of the issues that universities are struggling with is they don't want athletes to be employees. And the NCAA is also trying to fight against that. So the more you start to sign contracts and look like it's an employee-employer relationship, the harder it is to make that argument that that's not what it is. And that's been where they've struggled to find solutions as well.
Okay, thank you, President Mahoney, and thank you, Dr. Hightower. I will say this, that, John Wooden and Adolph Rupp and your friend Bobby Knight would roll over in the current environment.
Absolutely.
Just thinking about a really nice Bobby Knight on the sideline. Famous players.
Did Bobby Knight ever throw you out of a game, Ed?
Oh, he tried to. I reminded him that for 40 minutes, I was the most powerful person. I was the most
Okay.
powerful person in the arena.
All right. Next, we will close the meeting and go into executive session. I move to close the meeting to the public for the purpose of considering pending, probable, or imminent court proceedings against or on behalf of the board, appointment, employment, compensation, discipline, performance, or dismissal of specific employees, collective negotiating matters between the public body and its employees or their representatives, or deliberations concerning salary schedules for one or more classes of employees, and review of executive session minutes. The relevant sections of the Open Meeting Act statutes that allow for closed sessions are 5 ILCS 120/2, (c), (1), and 21. Do I have a second to the motion?
Second.
Been moved and seconded. Madam Secretary, please call the roll.
Avicenna.
Yes.
Barnett. Yes. Connolly.
Yes.
Curtis.
Yes.
Gilbert.
Yes.
Hightower.
Yes.
Salver.
Yes.
Simmons.
Yes.
Williams.
Yes.
Motion carries. We'll now go into executive